Hello and welcome to the first chapter of this microeconomics course. In this video, I'll be introducing you to the key topics we'll cover in this chapter and introduce you to the basic model we'll be using to help understand some very important microeconomic concepts. Firstly, we'll look at the Production Possibilities Frontier, or PPF. The PPF is simply a very basic model of an economy where only two products are produced. The PPF will be our tool for investigating how an economy behaves without having to conduct real-world experiments. The PPF will be our ant farm, where we can experiment and investigate how an economy might behave in a controlled environment. Once we understand what the PPF represents, we'll discuss how choices and scarcity are represented in the model and why these are such important concepts in the field of economics. In the third chapter, we'll begin analyzing marginal impacts. These are impacts, up or down, positive or negative, which occur on the margin. And by marginal analysis, we mean analyzing the benefit or cost of the last good consumed or the last unit produced. The last two chapters will look at economic efficiency and economic growth respectively. We'll use the concepts of choice and scarcity and apply marginal analysis to help identify the most efficient production choice for our experimental economy, or PPF. We will then look at how the PPF can help us understand economic growth and its impact on economic efficiency. So what is the PPF? The PPF is a curve or graph which represents the total or complete or frontier of all the production combinations possible. Think of the PPF as a graphical illustration of all the possible combinations of goods you could buy with a month's salary, except that instead of buying goods, we're now looking at all the combination of goods that can be manufactured. A more formal definition of the PPF is a model which illustrates all the different and possible combinations of two goods that can be produced by a limited number of resources. Let's briefly go through each statement. The term different and possible implies the PPF will show which combinations are possible, and that if a combination is not in the PPF, it must imply that that combination is not possible. This concept will become clearer shortly. The phrase two goods implies we are investigating a very simple economy where only two products are produced. Finally, the last term, a limited number of resources, implies that our simple economy does not have an endless amount of productive resources. You can therefore already anticipate that restrictions or trade-offs will have to be made. But what do we mean by productive resources? Productive resources are limited elements which are used for producing goods and services. For example, labor is used in producing goods and services such as furniture or even haircuts, and we know labor is limited by the size of the population. Capital, which can be thought of as land and machinery or even financial loans, are also used in the production of goods and services, but are not humans and are limited by the size of the land or by the technology used. Lastly, time is a productive resource. With more time, we could produce more. Before finally introducing you to what the PPF actually looks like and how it functions, let's discuss why we're using a model which is so different to the real world. The reason why we use such a simple model of an economy with only two different goods is because it's simple to use while still allowing us to fully investigate the economic concepts we want to learn and understand. To begin our analysis of our simple two-good economy, we need to choose two different goods or services. In this chapter, I'll be using power lines, measured in kilometers per year, and wheat, measured in tons per year. We then have our PPF for our simple economy, with the amount of power lines produced on the y-axis and the amount of wheat produced on the x-axis. Remember, this is a productions possibilities graph, so we're measuring how much of each good is or can be produced. Notice my choice of products. One product, power lines, allows for the supply of electricity, which is an important input into manufacturing. So the more power lines we have, the more productive our economy can be. While the other good, wheat, is a consumable good, something we eat and can never use again. In most economies around the world, difficult choices often have to be made regarding which type of good should be produced. For example, a starving population might need food and water to survive, but without bridges and airports, the economy will struggle to grow out of poverty. Looking back at our PPF, let's pick a random point or production allocation. Point G. Point G represents a production allocation of 1 ton of wheat and 5 kilometers of power lines per year. But recall the definition of the PPF. All production allocations possible. So how do we know where the limit is? We know the limit is defined by how many productive resources there are in the economy, but we need more information. Usually, you'll either be given the PPF curve with points illustrated on the graph, or you'll be given a production table or schedule from which you can draw the actual PPF. Table B below is exactly that table. Table B illustrates some possible combinations which relate to the full use of productive resources. In other words, Table B illustrates different production combinations possible when all the productive resources are used in our simple economy. We therefore do not need to know exactly how many laborers there are or how much land is being used. All we need to know is that the allocations in Table B are only possible if all the productive resources are utilized. This is an important assumption which I will explain in a moment. But if all resources are used, how come there are different combinations possible? Well, resources can be shifted between production activities. In fact, we could use all resources to produce only one good, which is what points A and F actually represent. So let's plot the points from Table B onto our axis in graph A. So point A in Table B is the point on the PPF graph where all resources are used to produce power lines only, so no wheat is grown. Point B, on the other hand, represents an allocation where most resources are being used to produce power lines and only some are used to produce wheat. Already we can see how moving productive resources away from producing power lines to wheat decreases the amount of power lines produced and increases the amount of wheat produced. And so on. Let's plot the remaining points from C to F. Note point F represents the opposite of point A, where all resources are now being used to produce wheat. Because these are only some allocations, we need to represent all possible allocations where all resources are being used, or in other words, full employment. To do this, we simply need to connect all the points from A to F and draw our PPF. As you can now see, we have drawn the PPF curve. Although we have highlighted points A to F, all the points on the curve represent possible production allocations at full employment. So between point C and point D, there could be hundreds of other allocations. One allocation might be 2.5 tons of wheat and 10 kilometers of power lines, for example. Because the points on the PPF curve we have just drawn represent production allocations where there is full employment, our economy cannot produce more of one good without reducing the production of the other good. For example, at point C, the economy is using all of its productive resources to produce 2 tons of wheat and 12 kilometers of power lines per year. But what if the economy wants to produce an extra 2 tons of wheat? This would be point H. In order to produce an additional 2 tons of wheat, additional labor and land is required. But since the economy is already producing at full employment, the only way to produce more wheat is to move resources away from producing power lines to producing wheat. And so we cannot keep producing power lines. And therefore, the only possible allocation at full employment with 4 tons of wheat is actually point E, where you can see how much the production of power lines had to fall in order for more wheat to be grown. Because we can only increase the production of a good by lowering the production of another good when we're on the PPF line, we call all points on the line production efficient. It's efficient because there's no wastage of productive resources. Unlike point G, which lies inside the PPF and therefore does not represent an allocation with full employment. If we wanted to increase the production of wheat or power lines when we're producing at point G, all the economy has to do is employ any idle resources until the full employment is reached and we're back on the PPF line. Remember, there's an infinite amount of different production allocations of wheat and power lines within the PPF which are possible, but only points on the PPF are production efficient. Points outside the PPF, like point H, are not possible because the economy does not have enough resources to produce so much of each good within the same amount of time.